What do Tucker Carlson and I have in common? We both had the opportunity to interview Douglas Wilson, who has been described as the most dangerous pastor in America. Tucker's recent interview with Doug focused on Christian nationalism and why that should be a goal for Christians and how it could come about. My interview with Doug focused on the Christian denomination called the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, or the CREC. Doug was instrumental in founding of the CREC, and our discussion focused on efforts of that church to be biblically faithful, to avoid the errors of other denominations that have gone woke. Have a listen to a truly salty shepherd, that is Doug Wilson, and how he has been used by God to bring about change in this world. Here I am, finding myself in Moscow, Idaho. Been coming here for more than 20 years, benefiting a lot from the work that's been going on here. You might know I was one of the original readers of Credenda Agenda.
Okay, it takes you way back.
Takes me back. History conferences, Trinity Fests. 5 of my children have graduated from the college here, New St. Andrews, have gone on and married. 6 of my grandchildren are here in town, and I'm in for a wedding, so glad for the opportunity that you've allowed us to come in and talk to you. One thing we wanted to chat about was the CREC.
Okay.
So start with maybe the history, and probably ought to tell us the acronym as well, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, the first thing people ought to know is the requirement of the CREC is that you have to wear check shirts.
We got it, man.
That's fundamental baseline. CREC stands for Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. It's gone through a name change over the years. It was Confederation of Reformed Evangelicals, and we changed it to Communion to more accurately reflect what it was we were trying to do. And we made it churches. It was not an association of persons. So it's now the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, okay. The CREC. We had a ministry that was starting to thrive here in Moscow and was having an impact. My dad had selected this location because of the universities, University of Idaho, and then Washington State is right across the border in Washington, in Pullman, Washington. And a couple of men who were greatly impacted by the ministry here during their college years went back home, one of them to Bellevue, Washington, and one of them to Wenatchee, Washington. And they wound up pastoring churches there. And they sort of, at the time, our church, Christ Church, was named Community Evangelical Fellowship, CEF. And these men impacted by the ministry started Eastside Evangelical Fellowship in Bellevue and Wenatchee Evangelical Fellowship in Wenatchee. Okay. And somewhere in my doctrinal pilgrimage, I'd come to Presbyterian convictions. Our church was an independent Jesus people type of church, started in 1975.
So Presbyterian plurality of elders primarily? Is that the starting
plurality
point?
of elders and broader association outside the local church.
Yeah.
So I come to Presbyterian convictions, and we had these 2 sister church, organic, informal sister churches. And so the idea occurred to me that we ought to associate, and we hammered out a rough constitution, right, and met to hammer out the details, and formed this this denomination, this communion, initially with 3 churches. Okay, I was also, although I'd become Presbyterian in my convictions about church government, I was also suspicious of over-centralization. I read Gary North's book, Cross Fingers, about how the mainline Presbyterian Church had gone under. And it was because of, when headquarters develop,
yeah,
and you have file cabinets and telephones and undersecretaries,
you're right.
There's a certain kind of person who always knows how to figure out where the levers under the desks are.
Yeah, the loopholes.
Loopholes and workarounds, and bureaucracies develop. And so, excuse me. And so we developed the CREC in a way that we had a communion of like-minded churches. At the same time, the overwhelming control of what goes on in the local church resides with the local church. So, and there are a number of ways that we do that, but we have broader fellowship, broader accountability without handing over the keys to headquarters in Atlanta or headquarters in Seattle.
Right. Very good. So so there's a whole group of people, good Christian brothers, that have seen denominations, especially those in the Reform camp, go south quicker than a Canadian goose after the first frost, right? And so they're leery of joining that. In fact, there's some that celebrate being non-denominational, standalone.
Right.
So what counsel would you offer to them with regard to a biblical rationale of why that may not be the best, or why being in unity with others would be better?
So this is going to sound trite, but Bible.
That's simple.
It's that simple. So I would say to them, you got married, right? How many marriages in your town are healthy? How many marriages go south? Mm. If you reasoned about marriage the same way you do about denominations, you just live together.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But you can't do that because Bible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's
trick
right.
chair.
Right there. Yeah. So I believe that the Bible teaches us that we are to have broader connections outside the local church. That's one thing. Mm. The second thing, on the pragmatic level, is we've all seen horror stories of denominations going woke or going soft or going bureaucratic or hardening in the wrong ways. But I've been in the ministry for 40 plus years, and I can tell you some local church horror stories. Right? Yeah. Just the fact that you've got a local church doesn't keep someone from wanting to be the pope of of that little fiefdom. Right. There are all kinds of doctrinal disputes or disputes over other trivial things that can happen in the local setting. And when that happens, you want to have at least the possibility of godly eyes from outside who don't have a dog in the fight to be able to come in and help you sort it out.
Okay.
And that is not perfect either. You know, this is a fallen world, and people are sinners. You can always find someone doing it wrong. But our task as Christians is to ask, what form of polity does the Bible teach? Right. And I believe the Bible teaches, in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council is a group of churches meeting together to discuss a doctrinal issue of common concern.
Yeah. So how would the CREC embody the Acts 15? How would that take arms and legs and work itself out?
So, for example, we want, when I was the presiding minister of, well, let me explain what the structure is. We currently the CREC has 7 presbyteries. There are about 100 churches in the CREC. There's seven presbyteries. The presbyteries meet for business once a year, and many of them meet for fellowship and other things at another time in the year. So the presbyteries oftentimes meet twice during the year. The council, which is everybody, meets every 3rd year. Unlike, and this is different from the OPC and the PCA, unlike them, they have a General Assembly, and at the General Assembly it's massive because every church sends 2 delegates to the General Assembly, and so it's a big convention. Yeah. What we do is the presbyteries have their meeting, and each presbytery sends 2 delegates to council. So currently with 7 presbyteries, we have 14 delegates at council. And then every 3rd year when the council meets, all the presbyteries meet at the same location at the same time. Right. So you've got 7 presbyteries and a council meeting, and it's possible for them to talk to each other. You know, you could have some sort of communication. an example would be when I was presiding minister for one term of the council, and I was presiding minister when the Obergefell decision came down.
Gay mirage.
Gay mirage, same-sex mirage. And so I issued a statement on behalf of the CREC condemning this move. And the way it works is the presiding minister of a presbytery or the presiding minister of the council can speak for the denomination. But then what he says is then ratified by the next subsequent meeting of the council or the presbytery.
Right.
So it's conceivable that the presbytery, if the presiding minister outran his own headlights, the council or the presbytery could walk it back and say no, that we don't stand for that. He did poorly there. But if they ratify it, then that means that in between meetings of presbytery or in between meetings of council, you were represented by a person, an individual.
Like a headship, covenant headship.
Well, like a covenant representative.
Yeah.
All right. So because what happens in what I might, if I might do this, in bureaucratic Presbyterianism, there's always a continuing presence of the church in between presbyteries. But in bureaucratic Presbyterianism, it's by the functionaries or the committees and no committee has ever been held responsible for anything. But a person can be. Right? If so-and-so says, let's say I condemned Obergefell on behalf of the CREC. Well, let's say I had there was some trivial Supreme Court decision that I personally didn't like, and I did the same thing.
Right.
I can be held responsible for that.
By your brethren.
By my brethren. Right. I'm accountable.
Right.
And so what we wanted to do was to make it personal and accountable without falling into the trap of another form of lack of accountability, which is what you see in the Episcopal form of government, where the bishop is the bishop. The bishop is that for life.
Yeah.
Right. So we are identifiably Presbyterian, but with a personal representation by the presiding minister in between sessions. The other thing that we do that is important is that every presiding minister of every presbytery and the presiding minister of council has to be the pastor of a church. So it can't be his main gig. Right.
He's busy doing other things.
He's a full-time pastor. So our current presiding minister is Virgil Hurt. He is the pastor of Providence Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. That's his day job. That's his responsibility is his church. And so in order to be entrusted with this position, you've got to be in the ranks yourself and not be a full-time functionary, not be a full-time State Department employee.
Yeah, scary stuff, huh? Maybe a little switch here is there's also a concept of confessional, or being confessional. So can you expound a little bit on that? Why that's important?
Confessional means that we have a system of systematic shorthand that can tell you what you can expect to hear from the pulpit. Unlike some conservative Bible churches, some independent churches, and some other churches, they require every member to subscribe to the church's confession.
Right.
And we don't do that. Right. We require the church as the church to subscribe to a confession. Our church subscribes to the original British Westminster Confession. And and as the standard in Presbyterian circles, if we disagree with certain portions of it, we take exceptions this is what we believe, and if we would quibble with this, and this, we tell you what that is. So it's a way of learning very quickly what sorts of things you're going to hear from the pulpit. Now, if you joined our church, you could be, we're Calvinistic, we're Presbyterian, we're all these things. Someone could be not post-mill, not Reformed, be a charismatic, and still join the church. What they have to do is confess that Jesus is Lord in the sense of the
As
Apostles'
a member,
Creed.
you mean?
To become a member.
Okay, yeah.
They have to basically confess that Jesus is Lord in the sense of the Apostles' Creed and not be living a wild and dissolute life.
Right.
If they're living like a decent Christian and confess that Jesus is Lord, then they can join the church.
So they're coming to the membership as a child, not as a seminary professor.
Correct. We don't want a denomination of 10,000 theologians. Okay, that would be bad.
Yeah.
The confession. So the way the confessions are set up in the CREC, in order for a church to come in, every church is required to adopt into their documents the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the definition of Chalcedon. Mm-hmm. Those are the three mandatory confessions.
Yeah. From the ecumenical councils.
Creeds.
Going way back.
Going way back. So every church holds to those. And then we have an array of reformational confessions that they have to select from. Okay, so each church holds to those three basic ones. And then our church holds to the Westminster Confession, 1646. You can also adopt the American Westminster. You could adopt the Heidelberg Catechism. You could adopt the Synod of the Canons of Dort. You could adopt the London, here's the quirk, you could adopt the London Baptist Confession, 1689.
Right.
And so you have to pick one of those things. And we've agreed that we're not going to adjudicate doctrinal disputes that arise because of differences between those
creeds,
between those confessions. But if a church says, okay, let's say a pastor started saying, I'm not sure about this Trinity business. Okay, and he finds himself, the church has this confession, and he's in egregious violation of it. Any two members of the church can appeal the situation to presbytery, and presbytery can come in and look at it, say, he does deny the Trinity.
And they speak back to the church, if I got it right, versus
correct.
They're trying to put local power, empower the local folks to take the right decision with encouragement.
Correct. And in the PCA, for example, and in the OPC, an ordained pastor is not a member of the local church.
Right.
The ordained pastor is a member of presbytery. Okay, and we don't do that. Every ordained minister has to be a member of the church where he's pastoring. Right. And so when we ordain a man, let's say a man comes out of Greyfriars Hall, which is our ministerial training program here at Christ Church. It's not the only way to do it, but we do that. Let's say a young man comes out of Greyfriars Hall and he wants to be ordained to the ministry. He's referred to presbytery, and presbytery examines him. And if he's a newbie, sometimes, we have to do two different things. Let's say a man comes to us from the PCA. He's been ordained before. He's been run through that gauntlet. We have a presbyterial exam that's a getting to know you exam. Right.
The character stuff.
Character stuff, and is this a good fit? And do you know about what we're about, and what are you about? Right. It's a getting to know you. It's not trying to test his Hebrew chops. Okay. But if he's just coming out of ministerial training, presbytery exam is it's grueling, and it's testing his Greek and Hebrew. It's testing his knowledge of the English Bible. So it takes a couple of hours on the floor, and there's written exams before. There's a committee that oversees, and then there's a final exam on the floor of presbytery. Yeah. Now what happens is, let's say the young man shines, does a great job. What presbytery does is recommends to the local session, we think this person is qualified and well qualified. We recommend you ordain him. Yeah. But he's then ordained not by presbytery, but by the local church.
He's in submission to that local church.
He's in submission to that local church, and he's authorized by presbytery, but commissioned and ordained by the local congregation. So that's one of the more unique features of our system. because the acts of government are still controlled. The central acts of government are still controlled by the local church. Now, let's say the recommendation is ignored. Okay, let's say Presbytery does not recommend. We think this guy needs
some work.
He needs some work.
Yeah.
Now, and let's say the local church ordains him anyway. They in essence tell the Presbytery to pound sand, and they ordain him anyway. Presbytery can look at that. Cannot. The church is doing what they have the right to do, ordain the guy, but Presbytery has the right to look at that and say, this guy is a train wreck. He shouldn't be anywhere near this. And the fact that you ordained him anyway over an egregious, unqualified man, we're not sure we're equipped to walk together.
Yeah.
So that church might be asked to go, but they didn't step out of their lane by ordaining. Right. It's just, I don't think that we are simpatico. I don't think that we're on the same page. But they might find out, Presbytery might say, we think you're running a risk. The local church might say, yeah, we know, but we'll make sure that he'll spend 6 months boning up on his Hebrew.
Right.
We're gonna do that.
Different story there.
And it's a different story. We'd say, okay, well, we warned you. But then everybody goes on merrily. The local church retains the local church holds the keys, and then when an appeal comes to Presbytery, it is with the recognition that the local church is where the acts of government are wielded.
Yeah. So back to Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem. You don't get a sense that was a standing commission working 24 hours, 7 days a week, right? It was a called entity that was there for issues, and then the local church was where the business was going on, right?
Right. That's what we try. That's what we're trying to do.
So you touched a little bit on this varying confessions, acknowledge differences, but yet people firmly ground in Scripture, and so maybe talk a little bit about the unity of us, the body of Christ, and the purity, and how to make those two practically work together.
Okay.
With different views on some important subjects, right?
Yeah. So unity, one of the problems that I think that evangelicals have had in North America, if they're interested in unity, is they have gone for a lowest common denominator unity. Okay, how much can we thin the soup and still call it soup?
Yeah.
Right. And so you'll have some soup kitchen in your downtown area, no creed but Christ, no law but love.
Right.
And
they can buddy up with Jehovah's Witnesses too, right?
Right. And first thing you know, you're dealing with Mormons. And, okay, this is pretty thin. That doesn't seem to be the way to unity. And that's the impulse of ecumenicity. Even in the mainstream, they want to minimize the difference between Lutherans and Catholics, and we're all saying the same thing. And pretty soon it's an etiolated. There's nothing robust or distinct about it. Mm-hmm. What we wanted to do was have all of our churches land on certain decided doctrinal convictions. This is where we are, and then take the problems that come, right? So if you've got a Westminster church and a London Baptist church,
right?
If you're on opposite sides of the country, no blood, no foul.
If you're in the same town, right?
But if you're in the same town, or the real problem comes up is when a person transfers, they move across the country, and they're a member in good standing in this CREC church, and they want to go to another CREC church, and they've got a 4-year-old who was baptized and has been taking communion for 3 years.
Right.
Okay, and then they come to a Baptist church.
Yeah.
Right, and the youngest baptized person is 12.
Yeah. Past the age of accountability.
Yeah, of course. what we do, and we're in the middle of sorting this out now. It presents a challenge, but Paul says in Ephesians 4 that we're to labor to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So that involves unity involves work. So we're working on how to, if you have a non-Paedo Communion church and a Paedo Communion church, or if you have Paedo Baptist, Credo Baptist, that presents challenges, but what we're just committed to working on it. The exhortation of the CREC Constitution is that we remember the law of Christ and we labor for unity, and we've got a sacramental committee, and we've got some sacramental recommendations that we're going to be discussing at this upcoming CREC. It's a challenge, but we're committed to doing it without demanding that people abandon their convictions.
So I think this is that's the nutshell of the Reformed churches. If you go back, right, they broke over the sacraments. And so the beauty for me is the CREC is trying to maintain that unity instead of just running in all different corners. So
we want to lean in, and the sacraments are probably the big challenge. Was at the time of the Reformation.
Right. So a practical question. So no deep state, no deep state at the headquarters that are running everything, that are running it with efficiency, sometimes into the ground.
There are no headquarters.
Yeah, no headquarters. So something practical like missions.
Right.
So oftentimes you see, the denomination's got a headquarters and they've got missions, and they've got all kinds of bureaucrats, even women over the ministers that are out on the field, right? So without that, by the way, I'm happy that there's no headquarters. How does the church handle something as important as missions?
The churches are free to support, to gather together on their own and support a missionary. So let's say you had Knox Presbytery could say, not as the presbytery, but as 6 churches in the presbytery could agree together, we're going to support this guy in New Guinea, or you can coordinate that way.
Right.
Another thing that you can do is, for example, there's a thing called JEEP, Joint Eastern European Project, I think it's.
I've had a chance to visit some of those churches.
Okay, and there are vehicles that you can set up that are not the CREC, but that can coordinate efforts of CREC churches and CREC-friendly churches. So for JEEP, which supports mission work in Eastern Europe, there's no requirement that you be a CREC church. It's just these missions on the ground.
So you'll find CREC churches outside of the U.S.?
Yes, there are. In fact, I said there's 7 presbyteries. One of them is the International Presbytery.
Okay.
So HUS. So our presbyteries are named after not regions, but after great men of the faith. Right. So our presbytery is Knox. There's Anselm. Let's see if I get them all. Anselm, Knox, Tyndale, Wycliffe, Athanasius, Augustine, and Huss.
Okay.
All right. So those are the current 7. Huss is the most recently formed. We have a church in Russia, Ukrainian churches, Hungarian church. I was just on a Zoom call yesterday. I'm on a committee with a church in Japan, the minister of a church in Japan, and a church in Hungary. So we've just had a Zoom committee meeting.
Yeah, international flavor.
The other day, and they are both in Huss, and I'm in Knox.
Yeah, so praise God. So that's where His kingdom should be found, in all nations and all, speaking to all tongues and all tribes. So the churches that started with three founding churches, and now over 100.
Right.
So how could you describe kind of backgrounds of those churches, those other 97 or more that have come? What would they look like?
So they look like, it's hodgepodge. That's what it looks like. Mm-hmm. We could call it the Cave of Adullam. So some of them would be formerly independent churches like ours was, that decided to associate. Okay, so the first 3 were independent churches that associated together. Sometimes it's a PCA church that decided to leave because of the woke or the semi-woke. Sometimes it's a PCA pastor who's been squeezed out because of doctrinal issues, and let's say half of the church went with him. And where do we go? What do we do? Other times it's churches planted. We've planted we have a church planting. The CREC is actively engaged in church planting. A number of people, and this is probably one of the most common things that happens, is because of the media outreach, and earlier it was Credenda, now it's my blog and Canon Plus and other things like that. People will say, hey, we've been tracking with your ministry, we're here. Yeah. There's like 12 families that are really interested in doing something like this. And can we find a sponsoring church? Sure. And what we do to be a CREC church, you have to have been in existence for 2 years. You have to have financial stability, right, and you have to have plural leadership, more than one guy. So if you're that's sort of the bare minimum threshold. Let's say you've got a church that's been meeting in somebody's living room for a year, and they contact the nearest CREC church, and they say, would you be willing to sponsor us as a candidate church? And they do. The church that makes the motion to admit them as a candidate church is the church that has to vouch for the spiritual health of that church when the motion is made to bring them in as a particularized church. So that's how it works.
By the way, I didn't tell you, but we only met in our house for 6 months, not for a year.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so if somebody shows up in a CREC church, what might they find? What might they find in the worship service?
So almost all, if not all, of the CREC churches follow what's called a covenant renewal worship pattern structure. And the structure might be compared to a skeleton, but they share the same skeletal structure. The service begins with a call to worship. Then there's confession of sin. Then there's a period of consecration. The word is preached. Then there's communion. The churches overwhelmingly observe communion weekly. Every week the service culminates in communion. And then there's the commissioning with the benediction where the people sent out. So that's a rough and ready structure. If you say, well, where does that come from? Well, it's pretty close to what you would call any kind of traditional worship service, as opposed to the rock band nightclub.
The happy clappy.
Yeah, not that kind of thing. But a traditional worship service of 100 years ago would have a lot of similarities with what we do. But this is in a nutshell. If you look in the Old Testament, where there were different kinds of animal sacrifices in the Old Testament. There was the guilt offering when you had sinned.
Sounds like we're going to Numbers.
What's that?
We're going to Numbers.
It's hardcore. We're into the books of Moses. There's the guilt offering. Then there is the consecration offering, sometimes translated in your Bibles as whole burnt offering,
right,
or ascension offering.
Right.
The whole animal is burned, and the entire animal ascends to heaven in a column of smoke. Yeah. And then there's the peace offering. And when those three kinds of offerings are mentioned in the Old Testament, they go in that order. It's the guilt offering, the consecration offering or the ascension offering, and then the peace offering. And so if you take the call to worship and the commissioning as the bookends, that kicks off the service and concludes the service, the meat of the sandwich is confession of sin, which corresponds to the guilt offering. Right. The consecration, which corresponds to the sermon, scripture reading,
Tithes,
things like
offerings,
that.
yep.
Some of the songs and so forth. And then communion, the Lord's Supper at the conclusion of every service corresponds to the peace offering.
Yeah.
And our service is an hour and a half in length, and we spend about 20 minutes of that hour and a half singing. So you should know that the CREC is a very musically oriented denomination. We sing a lot, and we are actively engaged in promoting and recovering psalm singing.
Praise God.
And some tiny Reformed denominations practice exclusive psalmody, which we don't. We sing hymns.
You have some new songs too.
We have some new songs too. But we do practice what I would call dominant psalmody. So most of what we sing would be from the book of Psalms and metrical psalms, sometimes through composed psalms, where it's just the text of the psalm that you sing through. But it's a lot of music and a lot of singing. The other thing to keep in mind about the worship service is that it's not a place where everybody comes and sits down and listens to the professionals up front do their thing, and then close in prayer, and then you go have coffee and donuts.
Yeah.
It's an active event, so everybody. It's a dialogue between God and His people, and the minister or the person up front is representing Christ to His people and speaks for Christ to the people, and then the people speak to Him in the amens, in the petitions, in the songs they sing. So it's an active dialogue back and forth. Another feature is it's a striking feature for many, is that our kids worship with us.
They don't get shuffled off.
They don't go off to children's church. The kids are there for the hour and a half.
Even the crying ones.
Even the crying
Are
ones.
they making a joyful noise, I suppose?
That's right. Now, we do have, there's crying, fussing, and you'll see at our church, dads walking their kids in the back, just walking. And then, so we welcome fussing, crying babies. But then we have a special room where the sermon and stuff is piped in. For babies who are flipping out. So if it's a meltdown,
the ones that need intervention.
that's right. If the baby is just being a kid and a little squirmy, then everybody just nobody even really notices anymore. But if the kid's flipping out, then they should be taken out and exhorted in the Lord.
So maybe one more question. This is a big softball, if I can. So, talked about the Psalms and what they have to say, and so we've seen in our lifetime we've seen churches that go woke, that are adopting all their talking points from whatever the world is saying, the egalitarian culture, feminism, and then there's a whole other group of people. So they have a lot to say about the culture, but they've adopted the culture. Then there's a whole other group of people that are pietists. They have holy huddles. They just get together and they have nothing to say about the world. So, and how would you and the CREC churches embody that prophetic voice?
So, let me just begin with an observation and then answer the question. The observation is during the clown years, the COVID crazy years, the lockdown years, the masking years and stuff. I was really proud of our churches because overwhelmingly they resisted. So when churches are told you're not essential, shut down, abortion clinics are essential and strip clubs are essential and pot shops are essential, but you're not. We have a bunch of ministers in the CREC who said, let us think about it. No, we're just gonna. So I was just proud of our people. They really acquitted themselves well. And one of the reasons the CREC is going through a current growth spurt is because a lot of Christians were let down by their leadership. They said, man, back in the day, you talked a good game, but then when the crisis happened, everything, it folded like a cheap yard sale card table. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is not the only feature, but it's a significant one, and that's the psalm singing. Okay, if you look through the whole Hillsong repertoire, or even a 19th century hymnal,
Standing in the garden alone.
Standing in the Garden Alone, you will find you'll have to look hard to find enemies. There are no enemies in praise and worship songs, and there are few enemies in standard hymnals, 19th century hymnals. If you sing the Psalms, they're full of enemies.
Every other page, every page.
Every other page. And sometimes the dealing with the enemies is kind of savage. Break their teeth in their mouth, O Lord. And you say,
Dash their infants against the rocks.
And you go, hey. Oh. So what I think one of the contributing factors to the CREC churches having iron in their blood is that we've been singing battle songs. We've been singing the Psalter. And the Psalter, Psalm 68, God shall arise and by his might put all his enemies to flight. That is the kind of discipleship and character formation, and
It gets into your bones.
it gets into your bones, and it gets into your bones in such a way as to ensure that you have bones. Because a lot of people revealed themselves to be jellyfish. There was like it had all the rigidity of a beanbag chair, and you say, no, we do. So the question I would ask is, do conservative Bible believing Christians in this world today, do we have enemies? Well, clearly we have enemies. They hate us. They're coming for our children.
Right.
They want to shut us down. They want to gag us. They want us gone. Yeah, we have enemies. So why aren't we availing ourselves of one of God's instruments for preparing us to meet those enemies? And the music is a big part of it. And of course, if you're doing that, then you might have a minister who doesn't just preach through Romans over 6 years. Nothing wrong with Romans, and I preached through Romans, got me in trouble. But so I try to preach through a New Testament book, a few topical sermons, and then an Old Testament book. So I've preached through Deuteronomy, and if you preach in an expository way like that, you can't really pogo stick through it.
No cherry picking, huh?
Yeah, you've got to deal with the texts.
Right, the hard stuff.
The hard stuff,
Right.
yeah.
Well, we are coming to our end of this video. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
May God bless the ministry here and the CREC as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for staying to the end. Leave a comment, good or bad. No worries, I have thick skin. Subscribe and pass it on. Attached, you'll find links to our ministries.